They said the sound of my tractor ruined their peace. But what they really wanted was the 1,700 acres it drove on. It started with a letter, a violation notice from the Oak Ridge Estates HOA claiming my chickens were too loud, and my tractor disrupted the peaceful enjoyment of their luxury homes. Funny thing is, my family's farm has been here since 1892. Their fancy neighborhood, built 8 months ago. I laughed at first, thought it was a bad joke. But it wasn't. It was a warning shot. The first move in a quiet war to erase 4 generations of farming legacy and replace it with condos and wine bars. In the next 30 minutes I'll show you how a corrupt HOA faked a land sale for 1,700 acres of farmland they never owned. How I discovered they overlooked one crucial fact. I still owned the water supply feeding their entire community, and how I used it, legally, to stop bulldozers, take back my family's legacy, and rebuild something more powerful than property. A community that finally knew what it was standing on. What would you do if someone tried to erase everything your family had worked for and called it progress? Would you back down? Or would you do what I did and shut off their water supply until the truth came out? I first saw her the morning after the first violation letter landed in my inbox. I was loading seed bags onto the back of my truck when the crunch of tires on gravel made me look up. There she was. Crisp white blazer, heels too clean for a dirt road, and a clipboard clutched like it was forged in fire. She marched across my front yard like she owned it. "Mr. Jackson," she called out, voice sweet but sharp. "Karen Wilson, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your activities." My boots were still muddy from the fields. But my gut? It was already churning. Karen had the smile of someone who'd never been told no. The kind of person who calls the manager of the sky when it rains on her brunch. She didn't ask, she declared. "Your tractor noise is affecting property values. The odor from your chickens is considered a disturbance under Municipal Code 42.3. The board has voted unanimously to issue a cease and desist." I crossed my arms. "My family's been farming this land since 1892. Your board doesn't have authority over a blade of grass outside your development." Her smile tightened. "Actually, your agricultural exemption expired last year. Technically, your land now falls under our expanded community standards. We're just ensuring compliance." Then she handed me a thick envelope. Signed, sealed, laced with threat. That was Karen's real talent. Making threats sound like favors. She didn't need a sheriff's badge or a gavel. She had bylaws, subclauses, and a whole board of silent yes-men. At first, I thought she was just another overzealous HOA president. But my cousin Tom, who lives 2 streets over in Oak Ridge, called that night. "Frank, Karen's been hosting closed-door meetings with developers. She's rewriting meeting minutes after the votes happen. Something's off." The puzzle pieces started to fall into place. She wasn't just annoyed. Ye tractors. She was building something. And my land? It wasn't a nuisance. It was an obstacle. Over the next few weeks, I started connecting the dots. HOA violations arrived like clockwork. Fencing height, aesthetic disruption, excessive livestock presence. Neighbors who once waved started looking the other way. Even the sheriff stopped by apologetically after Karen filed 9 noise complaints in 1 week. And behind it all, always smiling, was Karen. I started digging. And what I found buried in county records chilled me. A quiet land acquisition plan, filed under something called the Oak Ridge Community Trust. And a name on the advisory board? Karen Wilson. You see, Karen didn't want peace and quiet. She wanted square footage and profit. Turns out she wasn't just HOA president. She was also married to a commercial real estate investor from Westview Development Corporation. Their latest project? A mixed-use luxury zone stretching 1,700 acres east of the HOA line. Right through my wheat fields. Lesson. Not all predators wear camouflage. Some wear heels and carry clipboards. Karen wasn't fighting me over smells or sounds. She was laying the groundwork, slowly, legally, relentlessly, to wipe my family off the map. Because in her world, farms aren't heritage. They're placeholders for parking lots. But what she didn't know was that the ground she was circling with surveyor tape still flowed with water I legally controlled. And when someone tries to bury you with bylaws, sometimes the best answer is to shut off their taps. I was standing in the middle of my eastern field, mud on my boots, sweat on my brow, when a convoy of black SUVs pulled up along the fence line. 3 men in suits stepped out. Not farm suits, corporate suits. One of them, tall, with slicked-back hair and a tablet in hand, walked up like he owned the horizon. "Mr. Jackson, I'm James Miller, Westview Development Corporation, just here for preliminary measurements." "Measurements for what?" "Oak Ridge Common," he said casually, gesturing to the open field behind me. "Retail, condos, wellness center, you know, growth." I stared at him. "This is my land." He didn't flinch. "According to our purchase documents, this land was transferred to the Oak Ridge Estates Community Trust 4 weeks ago. They sold it to us. Sales final. Construction begins next month." My ears rang. I demanded to see the documents. He turned the tablet around. There it was. Survey maps. Digital deeds. My name, my land. So, signed, stamped. And I'd never seen a single page of it. I raced home, dug out my original property deed from the safe. Still in my name, still intact. I called the county records office. The clerk, a woman named Rivera who'd known my family for years, hesitated. "Mr. Jackson, there was a filing from 6 weeks ago. According to our database, 1,700 acres were transferred to the Oak Ridge Community Trust. You retain the 300 acres surrounding the homestead." "That's impossible. I never signed anything." "The system shows your signature, sir. Would you like the files emailed?" When the email came, my heart sank. Because there it was. My signature. Or at least something that looked a lot like it. Right beside the words, "Final transfer of agricultural rights and development permissions." I knew in my bones I had never signed that paper. But someone wanted the county to believe I had. I immediately called Sam Grayson, my lawyer of 15 years. He reviewed the documents in silence. Then looked up, eyes cold. "This is fraud. Sophisticated, layered, and dangerous. But it's still fraud. They used an old land use clause from the 40S, twisted it into a development clause, and paired it with a forged signature. How is that even possible? Because people rarely read what's in the back of a filing cabinet, and even fewer question the HOA. Sam explained that somewhere along the way, Karen and her board had filed a quiet claim on the land, claiming it as part of a community development zone. Then, using access to public records and a scanned copy of an old family signature, they digitally recreated a set of documents transferring ownership to the HOA trust. It looked legitimate. The stamps were real, the formatting flawless, the forgery near perfect, and worst of all, the developers had bought in good faith. Meaning, by the time I proved the sale was fake, the land might already be bulldozed, paved, and parceled. Lesson? You can lose everything you love without ever stepping into a courtroom. If you assume the paperwork is always telling the truth. Because in today's world, theft doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a seal and a signature. I stood in my office that night, surrounded by blueprints, deeds, and my grandfather's framed photo, and I made a silent vow. You forged my name once, but you forgot the one thing I still control. Water. And in this county, water flows where I say it does. Long before Oak Ridge Estates had cul-de-sacs, manicured lawns, or imported garden fountains, there was the reservoir, built in 1943 on the edge of my great-grandfather's land. It had one purpose: supply water to nearby farms during dry seasons. Back then, nobody imagined it would one day feed hundreds of luxury homes with saltwater pools and 5-ton sprinkler systems. And no one ever asked who actually controlled it, until it stopped. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I got there. The night after I saw my forged signature on those transfer papers, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, surrounded by yellowed maps, tax filings, legal forms, everything my family had kept locked in the old chest under the stairs. That's when I found it. Tucked between war bonds and a grain storage permit, a faded, typewritten agreement marked 1943, water allocation easement. At first glance, it looked like just another old contract. But then I read the fine print. Primary allocation rights remain with the landowner of parcel 122A, the Jackson homestead. All external usage permitted only so long as it does not interfere with agricultural need. My breath caught. Because parcel 122A was the 300 acres I still legally owned. The rest may have been stolen on paper. But the valve, the literal point of control, sat right next to my barn. The next morning I called my old college friend Sarah, now a top water rights attorney in the state. I emailed her photos of the agreement. 10 minutes later she called me back. "Frank," she said, "this document is bulletproof. Your family didn't just give the county access to water. They licensed it, with conditions. And what does that mean legally? It means if anyone threatens the agricultural use defined in that easement, you have the right to restrict, reroute, or rescind third-party access. Entire subdivisions have been shut down for less." I drove straight to the county water authority. The clerk, a wide-eyed young man named Dennis, read the papers twice. "Sir, if you're serious, this is going to affect hundreds of households." "I'm very serious," I said. "They took my land. Now I'm taking my water." He hesitated, then stamped the request. Filed. Effective in 48 hours. At first, no one noticed. Sprinklers ran, showers flowed. But when Saturday morning came, the day Oak Ridge residents watered their pristine lawns, washed their SUVs, and hosted their brunches, the taps ran dry. A trickle. Then nothing. Panic set in like wildfire. My phone exploded with calls, texts, and voicemails. Even Karen called. 17 times. On the 18th I picked up. "What did you do?" she shrieked. "You can't just shut off an entire community's water." "I didn't shut anything," I said calmly. "I redirected it. Legally, to my 300 acres. Per the 1943 easement. Agricultural use takes priority. People need water to live. And people need food to eat," I replied. "And I can't grow crops without water, especially on land you stole." Lesson: people don't question where their comfort comes from until it disappears. Water, food, true, it's always in the background until someone turns off the valve. As the sun rose over my drying wheat field and the HOA board scrambled for answers, I knew one thing for sure. They had started a war with a man who knew how to wait for rain. And now, I was the storm. It started with a whimper. A few trickling faucets on Ridgeview Lane. Then a full-stop silence in the master bathrooms of Oak Ridge Boulevard. By 10 a.m., the HOA hotline had 137 complaints. By noon, the community Facebook group turned into a wildfire of panic and entitlement. No water for coffee? What are we, savages? My Peloton shower. I paid for a 5-dung irrigation system. Some blamed the city. Others blamed God. But a few started asking the one question they'd never thought to consider. Where does our water actually come from? Meanwhile, I was enjoying a quiet breakfast. Black coffee, buttered toast, a view of my 300 acres still rich with spring wheat. Then my phone rang. Again. Karen Wilson. I let it go to voicemail. Then voicemail number 12, number 13. On the 14th ring I picked up. Her voice came through like a siren on fire. "You had no right, Frank. This is illegal, unethical, disgraceful." I took a sip of coffee. "On the contrary, Karen," I said, flipping through the easement agreement. "It's perfectly legal, signed in 1943, agricultural priority. You may control bylaws. But I control the valve. What happened next was a masterclass in panic. Within hours, the HOA issued an emergency bulletin accusing me of sabotage. News vans showed up at the Oak Ridge entrance, filming angry residents holding empty watering cans. And Karen, she tried to call in the sheriff, claiming public endangerment. Sheriff Miller, an old friend from high school, showed up at my gate looking sheepish. "Frank, they're saying you cut off water to a whole neighborhood." "I redirected it," I said, handing him the documents. "Legally. Want to read it for yourself?" He took one look at the stamped papers, scratched his chin, and sighed. "I got to admit, I've never seen a water fight in court quite like this." But it wasn't a fight. Yeah, it was a warning. See, people like Karen build castles on assumptions. They assume they're untouchable. They assume no one will question them. And they especially assume no one from a dusty farmhouse has the means or mind to hit back. But that's the thing about legacy. You don't inherit the land. You inherit the fight. By nightfall, local news aired my interview. Reporter Julie Ramirez asked me point blank, "Where did you cut water to hundreds of homes?" I looked into the camera. Because they paved over the very soil that grows their food. Because they forged my name to steal land my family worked for generations. And because no one listened when I said enough. The clip went viral. By morning, reporters from 3 states called. Property blogs picked up the story. And a meme started circulating. "Don't tick off a farmer with the water valve." Even better? HOA residents began to split. Some still blamed me. But others? They marched right up to Karen's front yard demanding answers. "You said this was handled. You said the farmer signed. You didn't say he owned the water." She tried to calm them. But you can't smooth talk thirst. Less people ignore what sustains them until they're forced to feel the absence. And sometimes, justice doesn't knock on your door. It turns off your faucet. As Karen scrambled to regain control and Oak Ridge went into bottled water panic mode, I called one more person. My lawyer. "Time to take this to court," I said. "Let's see how they explain forged signatures and evaporating water under oath." The courthouse smelled like old paper and cold coffee. Outside, a line of news vans wrapped around the building. Inside, Oak Ridge residents filled the pews. Designer bags, tennis visors, and silent panic written across their faces. They weren't here for justice. They were here for damage control. The bailiff called the room to order. "I'll rise." Judge Martinez entered, a no-nonsense man with sharp eyes and a voice that could silence thunder. He didn't smile, didn't look at either side, just opened his folder and said, "Let's get to the truth." Karen sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 lawyers dressed like they'd just stepped out of a corporate boardroom. Me? I sat beside my attorney, Maria Rodriguez, sharp, fearless, and holding a 5-inch tick binder labeled Fraud Evidence, WHS's. She began with a photo. Black and white, blown up to poster size. "This is Frank Jackson's grandfather plowing the same eastern fields that were recently bulldozed. This land has been continuously farmed by the same family for 130 years. The judge nodded slowly. Then Maria dropped the hammer. "We present into evidence the original 1892 land grant, the 1943 water easement, and most importantly, a forensic analysis showing the signature used to transfer 1,700 acres to Oak Ridge was digitally fabricated." She handed the judge a folder stamped by 3 independent experts. Each report told the same story. Inconsistencies. Misaligned signature stroke pressure. Timestamp mismatches between scanned layers. The signature wasn't just forged. It was manufactured. Karen's lead attorney stood up in protest. "Objection, Your Honor, these are historical documents. They carry less weight than modern filings." Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow. Forgery is forgery, no matter the year. Then came the second blow. Maria wheeled in a cart stacked with 5 boxes. "These," she said, "are subpoenaed bank records from the Oak Ridge HOA board." Everyone in the room leaned forward. "What you'll find," Maria continued, are 5 deposits, each equal to 2% of the fake land sale's total value, deposited into personal accounts of current board members. Within 48 hours of the sale, Richard, the HOA treasurer, paled. Sweat dotted his collar. Karen's hands gripped the table. She stared straight ahead, but her mask was cracking. Judge Martinez flipped through the evidence, then looked over his glasses. This court finds substantial reason to believe fraudulent activity occurred in the execution of this land sale. He turned to Karen. Mrs. Wilson, you are hereby under investigation for real estate fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud the county. The courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped to their feet. Karen tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She looked at Richard, betrayal in her eyes. He looked down at the floor. The empire had collapsed under the weight of its own lies. Truth isn't always fast, but when it shows up, it tends to bring receipts. Karen thought she could manipulate systems, hide behind bylaws, weaponize silence. But she forgot something critical. Paper can lie, but water remembers. And so do farmers. Judge Martinez slammed his gavel. An immediate injunction is issued halting all development on the disputed 1,700 acres. Furthermore, this matter will be referred to the district attorney's office for criminal proceedings. Karen's face crumpled. She wasn't just losing a court case. She was losing everything. As the room emptied, residents came up, one after another. We had no idea. We were never told. Thank you. But I wasn't finished. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. The courtroom hadn't even emptied when the real shift began. Karen stumbled out the side exit, surrounded by microphones and camera flashes, her once pristine blazer wrinkled, her voice trembling through pre-written sound bites. But the power, it didn't leave with her. It stayed right there, in the hands of the people who finally saw what had been done in their name. 3 days after the trial, a notice went up at the Oak Ridge Community Center. Emergency. HOA board meeting. Public attendance encouraged. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. Tom Baker, my quiet neighbor from the far corner of the subdivision, was the first to knock on my door. They're holding a vote, he said. Not just about Karen. About everything. I walked him to the edge of my property, past the irrigation lines now humming with redirected water. Tom glanced at them. Funny, he said. We all thought we were the ones feeding the HOA. Turns out it was you keeping us alive the whole time. At the meeting that night, the turnout was overwhelming. Normally, 10 people showed up, 12 if wine was served. This time, there were over 100. And they weren't there to nod politely. They came with questions, receipts, and rage. Emma Douglas, a retired teacher who'd once voted to fine me over offensive odors, stood at the front with a trembling voice. I supported the board because I thought they were protecting us. But I never agreed to stealing land or bullying a man who's been here longer than any of us. A younger couple raised their hands. We moved here for peace and open skies, not to be pawns in a land scam. The murmurs of agreement grew louder. Then Richard, the treasurer, stood up. Pale, hollow. I want to resign, effective immediately. Gasps filled the room. Karen lied to us all, he added, but I didn't stop her, and that's on me. He turned to Tom. You've been the only voice of reason during this mess. I nominate you as interim president. Tom blinked. Me? Someone clapped, then another. Then the room erupted in applause. Sometimes the loudest power isn't in the hands of the corrupt, but in the silence of those too afraid to speak. But when that silence breaks, everything changes. By the end of the week, half the board had stepped down. A temporary leadership council was formed, and for the first time in HOA history they invited me in. Not as a defendant, not as a nuisance, but as a partner. We sat around a folding table in the community center, residents, former critics, even a few developers. I shared an idea that had come to me late one night. What if we stop pretending the farm is the enemy and start seeing it as the bridge? They listened, really listened. And in that room, something rare happened. A community once divided by fences and forms found its voice, and more importantly, found its heart. The next week I walked through the fields with Tom. He pointed at a clearing near the edge of Oak Ridge. What if we built a small farmer's market here? You supply the crops. We supply the customers. I smiled. Let's plant something new. 3 weeks after the verdict, I got a knock on my kitchen door. Not the front door. The side door, the one friends and family use. It was Rachel Monroe, the newly appointed CEO of Westview Development. She didn't come with lawyers or contracts. Just a leather notebook, mud on her boots, and a look I hadn't seen from any developer since this all began. Respect. Mr. Jackson, she said, we made a mistake. Our company bought into a deal that should have never happened, and we want to make it right. I offered her coffee. She didn't hesitate. We've fired everyone involved. The old CEO is under investigation. But we still believe in this community and in building something that actually fits it. At first I was cautious. Burn me once, shame on you. Burn my crops, forge my name, demolish my legacy? Let's just say I wasn't about to start drawing up garden beds for a second round. But then she opened her notebook. Inside was a proposal. Something different. We want to lease just 50 acres, legally this time. We'll fund a crop processing facility that supports local farmers across the county. Jobs, equipment, logistics, all in one place. We also want to build a farming education center for kids and schools from nearby towns. I stared at her. No condos, no golf carts, no yoga on rooftops. She smiled. Only if it's goat yoga and you get to pick the goats. I laughed for the first time in weeks. Lesson. Sometimes the best revenge is cooperation done your way. Because legacy doesn't mean holding on to the past with clenched fists. It means knowing which parts are sacred and which parts can grow into something more. We brought the idea to the new HOA board. Tom presented it himself, wearing boots still dusty from helping me fix a broken irrigation pipe. This isn't about profit anymore, he said. It's about healing. And remembering why we moved here in the first place? The vote? Unanimous. That spring we broke ground on the new facility. Tractors rolled in, but not to destroy. They laid foundation for something rooted in real use, real purpose. Emma brought her famous cornbread to the groundbreaking. Kids from Oak Ridge planted the first row of sunflowers outside the new education barn. Even old Mr. Gonzalez, who hadn't spoken to anyone since the HOA fined him over a non-regulation bird bath, stood at the fence line and nodded. Now this, he said, feels like it belongs. Within 6 months, we processed over 3,000 tons of local crops, created 27 new jobs, 15 of them to former Oak Ridge residents, and welcomed 400 school kids to hands-on farm tours that didn't involve brochures but soil and sun and stories. One kid asked me if corn grew underground. I smiled. No, but good ideas do. You just have to plant them right. And as the fields healed, so did the people. Lines that once divided the farm from the neighborhood started to blur. People brought pies to board meetings. Developers asked before digging. And Karen, well, let's just say she wasn't invited to the ribbon cutting. One afternoon, as I walked the rows near the new market square, Rachel caught up to me. We could have ruined everything, she said. But somehow you turned it into something better. I looked across the land, restored, repurposed, reborn. I didn't do it alone, I said. I just refused to lose what mattered. 6 months earlier, if you'd told me the folks in Oak Ridge Estates would one day plant carrots beside my corn, I'd have laughed. Or maybe spat. Back then we lived on opposite sides of a fence. Not just a physical one, but a fence made of assumptions, silence, and HOA violation notices. But after the trial, the flood of truth, and the fall of Karen's empire, something unexpected took root. Curiosity. It started small. Mrs. Jensen, who once complained my rooster crowed too early, showed up at the edge of my property with a basket of scones. "I was wrong," she said simply, and I was hungry for more than just baked goods. We sat on my porch, the same porch she'd once taken photos of for aesthetic violations, and talked about tomatoes, trauma, and how silence can be more dangerous than shouting. Then the kids came. They showed up in packs. Wide-eyed, phone-holding Oak Ridge teens who'd never touched a shovel in their lives. Some were there for TikToks, but most stayed because the soil felt real in a way their curated lawns never had. One girl asked me, "Does corn have a gender?" I chuckled. "Ask the wind," I said. "It does the pollinating." She smiled. "Cool." We turned the field between Oak Ridge and my main barn into neutral ground. Literally. We flattened it, tilled it, and together built the first Oak Ridge-Jackson community garden. Each raised bed bore a name: the Douglas peppers, the Thompson tomatoes, the HOA survivors herb box. That one got the most laughs. Emma ran the garden sign-up table every Saturday. Tom organized a rotating irrigation schedule. Kids took turns with compost duty, and you'd never believe how competitive they got over zucchini height. But it wasn't just vegetables growing. It was trust. And not the HOA kind. The kind you earn with calloused hands and honest conversation. Less division thrives in silence. But healing starts the moment one side asks, "Can I help plant that?" And plant they did. We held the first farm-suburb potluck that fall. Dishes from both worlds shared one long table. Cornbread next to quiche. Deviled eggs beside vegan chickpea salad. Someone even brought artisan water from their fridge. I brought actual water from the spring behind my barn. No label, just truth. During dinner, a man in khakis and a tucked-in golf polo raised his glass. "To neighbors," he said, "the real kind." Everyone raised theirs too. Even Mr. Gonzalez, who now taught pruning techniques every Sunday in the orchard. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes folks still argued over mulch placement or tomato cages. But arguments now ended in solutions, not subpoenas. And for the first time in years, we weren't two communities. We were one. One day, while walking past the new market pavilion, I saw a little girl tugging on her dad's sleeve. "Can we go see the goats again?" she asked. Her dad, wearing a button-up and leather shoes, smiled and nodded. He didn't look like a farmer. But right then, in that moment, he was becoming one. They say revenge is best served cold. But I've learned something better. The best revenge is watching everything they tried to destroy bloom brighter than ever. It happened quietly at first. The survey stakes were gone. The bulldozers left. The noise complaints stopped. And slowly the land began to breathe again. We tilled what had been trampled. We reseeded what had been stripped. And we reclaimed what was ours, not just in court filings but in purpose. 6 months after the trial, the land was unrecognizable. Not because it had changed, but because it had come back to life. Crops waved in the breeze where concrete was once promised. The irrigation lines ran smoother than ever, fed by the very reservoir Karen never bothered to research. And at the edge of it all stood the sign we'd painted by hand. "Welcome to Jackson Fields, grown by neighbors." One morning I was tightening a fence post when a black SUV slowed by the road. Tinted windows. License plate I recognized. Karen. She didn't get out. She just stared for a moment. At the rows of sunflowers. At the new education center with laughing kids in overalls. At the market tents being set up for the weekly harvest. Then she drove off. No words, no waves. Just silence. That was all I needed. Because here's the truth. She tried to erase a legacy with ink and arrogance. But what she built in concrete, we rebuilt in roots. Reporters still called now and then. They asked about the scandal, the lawsuit, the water. But I always told them the same thing. That's not the story anymore. The real story? It's Emma's jam stand raising money for school supplies. It's the HOA teen who used to roll his eyes at dirt, now applying to agricultural college. It's the former HOA treasurer who apologized face to face and now volunteers every week pulling weeds. And it's my son, driving the tractor with a neighborhood kid riding shotgun, both of them laughing so loud it echoes off the silos. That's legacy. That's what survived. Lesson: some fights are won in court, but the most important ones are won in community. The ones where fences come down, where silence becomes solidarity, where us versus them becomes we. 1 year after the bulldozers came, we held our first harvest festival. Over 500 people showed up. Neighbors, farmers, former skeptics. Even a city council rep who once backed the development plan brought her daughter and bought 2 baskets of squash. We ate under string lights and danced in the field. Kids ran through corn mazes. Old folks swapped stories over cider. And I stood back, arms crossed, eyes full, because it wasn't about me anymore. It never was. It was about this land and the people who finally saw it for what it was. Not a blank canvas for luxury homes, but a living story. And the most beautiful part? Everyone got to write a chapter. So if you're ever standing where I stood, fighting alone, surrounded by paper bullies and concrete lies, just remember this. You don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to bulldoze to win. Sometimes all you need is the truth, a little land, and the courage to hold the line. Because when you do, the land doesn't just survive, it thrives. And that's a kind of justice no HOA can ever touch. Have you ever had to fight for something no one else believed in until you won? Comment your story below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories of everyday heroes.